Right, so any characteristic that you have, color of your hair, the color of your eyes, all of those are traits. And what is a gene?
Chemical factor.
And so not only is it a chemical factor, but it determines your traits. So what genes you have determines what you're going to look like, what your personality is going to be, etc. Does that make sense? And so what are alleles then? Different forms of what?
Gene.
So it's kind of like they work in layers. You have the gene up here, which determines the trait, and then you have alleles, which are different forms of genes. So alleles could be like you and your sibling have different hair color, or etc. Things like that. But genes are just like what carries the hereditary information. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then true or false? If a pea plant has a recessive allele for green peas, it will produce green peas. If it does not also have a dominant allele for yellow peas. It's actually true, because its alleles would kind of look like this. Little g, which is stands for green, green. So this would be green. But if it was, say, big Y, little g, that would be yellow. Because the Y is capital, so it takes over the lowercase. Does that make sense? Anytime there's a capital letter, that's what is going to be represented. So if I have big B, let's say big B, little b, that would be brown hair. But if I have little b, that would be blonde hair. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the capital letters are dominant. They dominate whatever the little letter is. So it doesn't matter what that is as long as there's a capital letter. Does that make sense? But when they're together like that, see how there's no capital there?
Right.
Then it has to be that. Make sense?
Yeah.
A little bit?
Yeah.
We'll work more with it. We're just starting. Number 19, we call each original pair of plants in a cross the what generation?
Parental.
Parental or P1? And then next page, we call the offspring what?
First filial or fictional.
First filial, or you can abbreviate it to F1. And that, because the Latin terms for son and daughter are filius and filia. So it basically means, offspring.
Yeah.
And so if the first generation is F1, what would be the second generation?
F2.
Exactly.
So the term for son would be filius, and then the term for daughter would be filia.
Exactly. Yeah, so in Latin, that's son and daughter. So you learned some Latin today. Okay.
Wow.
Go tell your friends. Alright. So Mendel was the guy who came up with these, and he produced the F2 generation. He discovered that traits controlled by recessive alleles, what? What happened?
They reappeared.
Exactly. So it's kind of like how I was talking here. In one generation, it would be there, but it wouldn't show up. And then in the next generation, it would just show up. So he did the first experiments to figure out, wait, how does that happen? And he did it on peas and pea plants, etc., the flowers and everything. And this occurred because when each F1 plant flowers and produces gametes, the two alleles what?
They segregate?
They segregate from each other. So you breed two plants together, but the genes for, say, the pink flower, they don't stick together. they cross with the other plant and produce another color. So he would cross like a red and a white flower, and he'd get a pink one. And he's like, huh, how did that happen? So he experimented. He was the first to experiment with the dominant and recessive alleles.
Excuse me, you're Luca, right?
Yep.
Did you get one of these? Because you're
Yes.
interested for the.
Yes, I do.
Okay, great. I'm really sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Alright, so number 20. Organisms that have two identical alleles for a particular trait are said to be what?
Homozygous.
Right, so homo means the same. So it's either big T, big T, or little t, little t. It's not one or the other. So the opposite, or on the other hand, organisms that have two different alleles for the same trait are called what?
Heterozygous.
Exactly. So hetero meaning different. So that's going to be these guys. These are heterozygous. And these two are homozygous. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that brings us to our Punnett square. If a heterozygous tall plant is crossed with a short plant, and a short is a recessive trait, what is the probability that an F1 plant will be tall?
50%.
Right. So let's look at our Punnett square here. It's not showing up. Here's our Punnett square. And we want to cross it with a heterozygous tall plant. So heterozygous means they're different. Tall means that they have the dominant trait. And then we want to cross it with a short recessive. So little t, little t. So you take this guy and this guy, this guy and this guy, and then these two, and then these two.
Punnett square. Here's your phone, please.
Mm-hmm.
What color eyeballs?
So it asked, what is the probability that it'll be tall? Well, two of these guys have the dominant trait, so 50%. Make sense?
Yeah.
Alright, that's a nice, simple Punnett square.
Yeah.
All tall plants have the same what? Number 21.
Phenotype.
Right. So phenotype is physical trait. So I always think the P with the P, physical phenotype, which is the opposite of the other one, which is
Genotype.
genotype. So genetics, genotype, physical phenotype. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the genotype would be this. The letters basically. And the phenotype would be, is it tall, is it short, etc. Make sense? Right. So then it goes on to this big Punnett square. I won't spend too much time on it, but basically you're crossing a homozygous, you plant that is homozygous for round peas, but heterozygous for yellow peas, with the other guy. Now, you won't have to draw one of these on the test, so I'll just go over like how you match it
Okay.
to like set one up, just so you know. Because these are tricky. So our genotypes are big R, little r, and big Y, little y, crossed with big R, and big Y, not Y, big Y, little y. So as you can see, based on the two different letters, the R's and the Y's, that there's two different traits.
Yeah.
And then you got some little letters mixed in with some big letters. But the trickiest part is how do you match those up to set it up on here? What you're going to do is you're going to take one R and grab it with that Y. And then take this R and match it with that Y. and then do the other Y.